You're listening to the world's smartest podcast network.
Hey everyone, Andrea here. Welcome to episode 10 of Majoring in Everything. I am really coming out nice and easy with these episodes, so thanks for your patience. I have a very expanded sense of time. Episode 10, I'm so excited to introduce to you and for you to meet my guest. My guest is my own father, Robert Rooy, and we'll talk lots and lots about him and with him in mere moments. I just wanted to flag now that I selfishly, perhaps, was so interested in everything my dad had to say that we went on for some time. So I am releasing this episode as a two-parter, and you can listen to part one now and stay tuned. Part two will come closely after. I also just want to plug that the project that we talk about more in part two, but I think we hint at it in part one. The project, the fundraiser for Tail Twister, his current documentary, is starting very, very soon, June 1, depending on when you're listening to this, June 1, 2022, in case you're listening to this from the distant future. And I'll post some links in the show notes and so on, so you can go check it out and hopefully be a part of it. But most of all, I'm biased, but I think my dad is awesome. And so I'm really honored that he sat with me and talked to me about his life and his career and his many winding paths and how he got to where he is and all his wisdom. So enjoy, and I'll see you in part two. Welcome back to another episode of Majoring in Everything. I'm your host, Andrea Jones-Rooy. We have come to the final episode of season 1. This is episode 10, and I have a very special guest for us today. This person is someone that I am very excited to have on the show, and I'm very excited to introduce to you all if you don't already know him. It could be you're listening to this show because we're related to each other, in which case you probably do already know him, but it's always fun to talk with him. Our guest today is a filmmaker, a Peabody Award-winning filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, and my father. So give a warm Majoring in Everything welcome to Robert Rooy. Hello, how are you?
I'm excited to be here.
Well, very good. And you are beaming in from Frederick, Maryland. Have I got that right?
Yes, indeed.
Yes, indeed. And before we do anything, this is a lot of people listen on audio, but I do want to flag that those who are watching can observe that for the first time ever in this podcast, I've managed to make my background more of a corner than a flat angle, which is one of many things I have learned from you about how to frame various pictures.
As you can see, I'm aimed into a corner here as well. So.
Yes. I was very deliberate about this. I even washed off the fingerprints on my fridge. So there's that. All right. Well, Majoring in Everything, as you may know, and certainly as our listeners know, is a show all about people who do more than one thing, and especially things that seem like they don't go together. So over the past season, we've talked to lots of people who've done lots of things with all kinds of interests. So we talked to a neuroscientist who's an open water swimmer and a physicist who's a rock star, that kind of thing. Today, there are two reasons I wanted to bring you on the show. Well, three. The third is you're my dad and I think you're awesome. But the first two reasons, well, that's the first reason. The second two reasons are that I wanted to have someone on the show who actually, I wanted to avoid selecting on the dependent variable, which is to say I wanted to talk to someone who to the outside maybe doesn't major in everything, maybe is super focused, really passionate about one thing. And when I think of you, I think of a dedicated filmmaker. My whole life, you've been making movies. And so it seems to me, and I have often aspired to be someone who focuses on one thing, I think largely because, well, for many reasons, but because I admire you. However, you and I have had conversations over the years where you have revealed that you don't always know what you're doing, or you're at a moment of inflection and it's not obvious what the next step is. And so the other reason I wanted to bring you on, again, in addition to you being my father, is that I was curious to talk about how certain people who seem like they have it all figured out, how certain they are as they go. Because to me, you've been a filmmaker since I was born and you've had it figured out. But when you and I have talked about that, you've suggested otherwise in some conversations. So that's what I'm going for here. Does that sound okay to you?
Sure.
Right.
That sounds fine.
It'd be great if you were like, I don't think so. And I'm like, all right, well, that's the end. Season 1's over. So I want to start, and listeners, I'm going to, I know some of these things that I'm going to ask, but I don't know all the details. And I actually am going to ask questions that I don't really know the answer to. So first I want to start you grew up on a farm in Iowa. And I think there's a picture of that farm right behind you. And so again, if you're watching on YouTube, you can take a look.
There is. Yeah. Right there.
And that's literally the place you grew up, right?
Yeah. Very literally.
Very literally. Did you take that picture?
I did. I was actually in my 20s at the time and visiting home and just went down the road, and I had just taken up photography. So I thought, this is a nice shot. And then I realized I couldn't fit it all into one shot. So I actually took two kind of back to back. And then when I was back at the Philadelphia College of Art at the time, I didn't go there, but that's where I was. I managed to print them out and meld them together.
Whoa.
And gave them to my parents as a present. But now that my parents, your grandparents, are gone, I got it, which I guess maybe people would suspect was my game all along. But
you're playing the long game of owning your own photographs.
And the sad thing about this is that of all the buildings, I don't know that you can make out the buildings, there's like 8 or 10 here. Only 2 are left because the people who bought the farm eventually what's it called? Basically fence row to fence row. And they take out all the extraneous buildings that you might have had on a farm where you had different kinds of crops and different kinds of animals. And now it's just soybeans, or corn. So only the barn and the machine shed are left, unfortunately.
Oh, wow. And so the house has been replaced or taken down and it's not even lived on anymore?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I feel bad. I'll eat less soy out of protest. How about that? I don't know if that'll do it.
It's kind of ironic, but I think the soy that gets grown there, so much of it actually just goes to feed animals, which is not a very good use of it, ultimately.
Right. All right. Well, I want to ask about this farm, and I want to know how a boy growing up on a farm in Iowa gets mixed up in the world of motion pictures. You're now a documentary filmmaker. You've been a first assistant director for all kinds of Hollywood movies and TV shows that people have seen and heard of, and they can look up your IMDb. And you've had a very varied, but a life that has wandered in and out of Hollywood in lots of ways. How do you go from farm to movies?
Not in one easy step.
Okay.
When as you know, I grew up in a very intensely Dutch Protestant community. And there are a lot of good things about it. I mean, in terms of work ethic, in terms of service, feeling like you need to serve your neighbor and other people. So it wasn't really restrictive in that way, but there were a couple of quirks, like we didn't really play games of chance. They were sort of edgy as to whether that was really, really a good thing. The other thing we didn't do is see movies. And the closest movie theater was a drive-in on the other end of town, and they showed Elvis Presley movies and Beach Blanket Bingo and things. I never had a chance or a reason to go there. But visiting my older brother, your uncle Sid, who's about 20 years older than I, on the East Coast during one Christmas break, Sid took my parents, your grandparents, and me to The Sound of Music. So that was my very first movie experience at age 17. And it was pretty remarkable because we were sitting toward the front, and the very first credit shots are of the Swiss Alps and Austrian Alps. And it was kind of like, not used to the movie perspective. It was a little like an E-ride at Disneyland. I didn't even know what an E-ride in Disneyland was either. So that was really the beginning. And then when I went to college, I majored in, well, I didn't major in, I pursued theater. And at the college, there wasn't a major or even a minor in theater. So my main life was really not necessarily with the courses, literature, speech, whatever else. It really was theater. And I managed to parlay that into an acceptance at Yale Drama School.
Well,
so you'd think So, as you know, but you think that would be a ta-da moment. Okay, theater, Yale Drama School. This is a career in theater, one way or another, and it wasn't, because for the first time I had access to as many older movies, contemporary movies, as I wanted to. See. The law school had a couple of movies every week. The undergraduate film society had a couple more. And so I discovered like Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, and developed this huge crush on this image of someone, 30 years earlier who I guess was 19 or 20 at the time. And it was kind of an odd experience in a way of just discovering movies in my 20s. But the upshot of it is that by the time I graduated from Yale Drama School, I had both feet firmly entrenched in film fiction. I thought at the time.
So how did you come to realize that theater was of interest to you when you you went to Calvin College and your actual major was English. Is that right?
Yeah.
Now this is just a referendum on what I know. But what was it, the movie that you were so impressed by? Was it Sound of Music that drew you to theater in the first place in college and then onward to Yale Drama School? Or was it something else that made you want to, drew you to being on stage or performing or something about that world?
Yeah, I think in undergraduate, my focus was still really theater. Okay. But I like the movies. In the local theater in our part of Grand Rapids, there was The Graduate, for instance, which, and a number of films of that time and place. And I liked them, but it was sort of outside my ken or outside my sphere of the possible at that point as to whether this was even a world that I wanted to pursue. And it really was when I played hooky from a lot of Yale drama stuff and went and saw movies instead that I really got involved in the art form. So I, like a lot of young people in the late 60s, early 70s at this point, imagine myself as an auteur filmmaker. This is Francois Truffaut, and the whole concept of auteur was the big one, which meant that, it's your vision that's going to be realized on the screen. And we can cover this in a little bit later, but I found that really mostly to be very far from the truth in terms of how movies get made. And how it's not usually one person's vision. Sometimes it is, but often it's a compromise between various visions, and often it's a compromise between various visions and economic reality or somebody's wish to just make a profit. So anyway, the things got contextualized for me, shall we say, as I moved on.
You've always had a way with diplomatic expression. I think that's a very nice way of saying you dealt with a lot of difficult people and did a bunch of stuff, but we'll get there. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So, or am I not being fair?
That's
okay.
Good. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so I'm picturing you in grad school. So what, your early 20s, like wearing all black and smoking cigarettes at like an indie film house. Is
Bingo.
That fair? Yeah.
I actually smoked for about 3 years in my 20s until I realized that I shouldn't, and I finally managed to quit. But that was part of the image. There was sort of there's somewhere lurking in my files. There's a picture of me directing a play and looking very intense, and the smoke is just curling up past my face.
All right,
this one of a kind, and I have no idea where it is right now.
What was your cigarette brand?
Marlboro.
Red?
I think there was just one kind of Marlboro at the time.
All right. Yeah. Well, now there's a whole rainbow of, doesn't matter how I know that, but yeah. All right. Well, what if we're both just smoking on this? Okay. Last question before we go to reveal some of the things you learned about how films are actually made is, I don't think I know this. When you were growing up, what did you think you were going to be when you grew up? Or what did you want? What was your vision of your future self when you were a child?
Well, it was the time of Dr. Kildare, and it was the time of a couple of law series on television. And so I think there was a part of me that thought, that sounds like a good and exciting thing to do. The traumatized version, at least, that I was exposed to. And then also in the more fervently religious parts, I think it's possible that I was going to become a pastor or a missionary in a very chauvinistic kind of perception of what that actually might mean and what would be demanded of a person. Mm-hmm. But so it was a little bit of all of those.
Okay. And I lied. One last question about this is that I'm also aware, somewhat through lore, of some skepticism from your parents and maybe other family members. I mostly hear about your parents as far as, being concerned that you were going down a path that wasn't very stable and your decision to go to Yale Drama School. How was it received by, your brothers and sisters are mostly still in the area. A lot of our family are practicing in the religion in some way. How was it perceived? Was it difficult to say, actually, I'm going to step into this other path that none of you have ever, known anyone else who's done this?
Well, actually, when I declared to my parents or shared with my parents that my desire to pursue theater, it was still when I was an undergraduate, and they were good friends with the college chaplain. And they actually, on one of their visits to Grand Rapids, where we had other family that they would come and visit, they sought him out and they said, well, what do you think about this? Is this possible? And part of his answer was yes. It's possible for anyone to be virtuous and have a Christian ethic in the theater. But on the other hand, there's a lot of temptation. And one of the things that he actually brought up was, down in the Civic Theater in Grand Rapids, there are a lot of homosexuals.
Wow.
Yeah. I wasn't part of this conversation, you understand. This is just as it was relayed.
Right.
By my parents at the time.
How did they receive it and how did they relate it to you?
They, to their credit, they trusted me and maybe to their detriment. I don't know. My family, generally speaking, went with this and went and said, this is your dream, go pursue it.
Okay.
Yeah. So that part was good. I think the way my mother would choose to tell other people, in fact, I have a story about that. At church, you say that, well, he's a graduate student at Yale University, but it's sort of shortened. One person said, and then of course, there are a lot of older generation people in the church who still have the Dutch brogue. And so it was, and I was called Bob in those days, not Rob. So, where is Bob? What's he doing? And she would say, he's at Yale. And one woman said, Yale, what did he do?
Yes.
So there was a lot of bridging of cultures going on, and but generally speaking, with my parents and other family members, they went with it.
Didn't you also get into Yale through some kind of strange circumstance? Didn't you have some interview that went really well, and then you wandered in, and that was it? Or is that twisted that in my memory?
I guess this goes under the topic of don't leave no stone unturned.
Okay,
but it's. Well, a couple of quick preambles to this. When I was you'll like this one. When I was still in college, and the main director of the theater programs and so forth warned me that she was concerned that I was becoming a jack of all trades and a master of none. Meaning, at that point in my life, I wanted to major in everything. So I was. Member of the debate department. I wrote for the school newspaper and I had my fingers in lots of things. And she said, I just think you ought to concentrate really on one thing, theater, of course. But, so what was the question that I gave you the preamble? Now
that's the preamble. Yeah. How did you end up at Yale? How did you get in?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And the other thing that that this person at one point allowed was that I was highly motivated. Take that as you will, but I was highly motivated enough in my senior year of college that back in those days, airlines had this thing called the student standby program. And you could just show up at an airport, and if there was a seat, they'd sell it to you for like a third of the going rate. And during the Christmas holiday of my senior year, I picked out like 8 or 10 different graduate programs around the country offering theater degrees. And I just hopped on standbys and I went all over the place. And I ended up at Yale Drama School was one of them. And Tom Haas, who was head of the directing department at that point, I sought him out, or somebody introduced us, and we were just talking in an office. We weren't even sitting down at this point. And it was a brief conversation. And he said, well, okay, you want to be a director. Let's talk. How about movies? What movies have you seen? And I had seen Alice's Restaurant. And he said, well, let's talk about that. And so I said, well, there's this whole thing that's sort of the parallel and the playing out of the song, which is a story in itself. And then they go off in a different direction. And this is about Alice. And it's just sort of this weird made up stuff. And he says, exactly. He says, it's 2 movies. And so cut to 3 or 4 months later, and what do I get back in my shoddy little apartment but an acceptance letter to Yale Drama School.
All right.
And because of my lack of resources, it was basically pretty much just paid for by Mother Yale. Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very good. Almost as good a financial deal as jail, I think. I don't know if they gave you food. Yeah.
But I guess it's a reminder that, go ahead and turn those stones over. And sometimes nothing will happen out of it. And sometimes it'll be, the stone will drop from a tree, mountain. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. You turn the stone over and there's something under it that you want. I'm not sure what the analogy. You're right that we want to turn stones over. And I don't know what the broader analogy is that it fits into.
Yeah, I know. It's beyond words. It's
beyond words, yes. All right. Well, since it's uncool to name drop oneself, I will just name drop to listeners that you also went to grad school with Meryl Streep and the Fonz and that woman from the commercial in the 90s, Fibercon or Metamucil. Those are the 3 that I know of. Have I got that right so far?
Who's the last one?
We would watch this. So we would always talk about, Meryl Streep we would ask you if she was a good actor and you'd be like, yeah. I'm like, okay, cool. And the Fonz. And then
Sigourney Weaver, maybe?
Oh, okay. Okay. But this was just someone in a commercial. And it was a commercial in the 90s, probably on like must-see TV Thursdays when we'd all watch Friends and Seinfeld and whatever. And a woman would come on and there'd be a countertop. This is obviously super important that we get to the bottom of this, that be this counter. And she'd be talking about 2 kinds of fiber supplements. And she'd say Fibercon or Metamucil. Both give you the same da-da-da-da-da-da. And
well, that's lost from my memory forever. I'm sorry.
But you were like, I went to Yale Drama School with that person. And so anyway, so a host of distinguished alumni.
I hope this isn't too much of a detour, but I was thinking, well, what are we going to talk about today, and what memory should I conjure up? And one of the things that I thought of is that there's a part of me and part of my life that feels a lot like Forrest Gump.
Oh yeah.
In that, in the movie, he's brushing elbows or intersecting with all of these key people in major historical events and so on. And I'm thinking, gee, I've had some of those. And it started when I was still at Calvin. My dad and I were on campus when Richard Nixon was speaking. This is before he ran for president, 2 years before, but nevertheless, that was a historical intersection. And then later, during the 1968 presidential campaign, I think Bobby Kennedy came to Grand Rapids, and I and a number of friends went out to the airport, and there was no security at that point, and it was just a whole bunch of us lined up along a chain link fence. And he came and he just worked the line. So I got to shake Robert Kennedy's hand, and that was only a few weeks before California and his assassination.
Wow.
Not to be maudlin about this, but I'm thinking of other things like people I knew at the drama school, and the end result of their being at Yale was high and low. I mean, so there are a lot of people I've just lost track of, and even the ones that I haven't lost track of are not people who I'm on a conversational basis with at this point, with a few exceptions. I mean, thanks for Facebook for our generation, and there are some people that I do keep in touch with. When I drove out to California to make the transition into movies, I drove all night, and I ended up at Paul Schrader, who was also a Calvin person and now, well-known filmmaker. I ended up on his floor watching a movie along with a few other people, including Joni Mitchell. And embarrassingly, I fell asleep during the movie because I had just driven for 24 hours. And so that's all I saw of Joni Mitchell. And there are a few other people like that. Well, there they go,
Yeah.
So.
Wow. You fell asleep near Joni Mitchell. Well, I fall asleep during movies all the time. So now I know where I get that. So thanks for that as well. All right. So you finish at Yale. Well, I feel like this is going to be a 10-part episode, but you have a year where you left Yale and then went back, right? And I'm very fascinated by this year in your life, because I have had several junctures where I was like on a path that was a path that people told me was a good path. And then I sort of was like, I don't know. And I wandered around for a while and then maybe came back in a different way or something. And it sounds like that was a time like that for you.
It was. And just another preamble is that I was still pretty culturally insulated when I was an undergrad. So when I got to Yale Drama School, we were doing an improv, and even the directors do improv at that point. And the improv was around the Marx Brothers. And so I was assigned to play Chico Marx. I had never seen Chico Marx. I had no idea what he was like, or the Italian accent, or anything else. None. So I went through this session, and the instructor at that point said, Rob doesn't seem to have much of a handle on Chico at this point. And, and then he sort of wrote it off because I'm a director and not an actor and so on. But I was really overwhelmed at that point and decided I needed to take a break and study up, and this was some personally chaotic times for me. And the same man, Tom Haas, said, why don't you take a year off and come back, and I'll hold a spot for you so you're back in sync, and you can continue. And then he and the other people ultimately were very supportive in letting me make my first film, which is not great, but whose first film is usually, so that's the reason for the year off. Now, was it wise for me to go back to a theater program and graduate with an MFA, even though I wasn't involved in theater anymore? It was, you could question it. I think just the life experience of it, another couple of years of being creative in a somewhat protected environment, is a good thing. Although Yale Drama School also was very competitive, and as I heard one of my fellow students say, it's easier to fail in New York City than it is at Yale. I mean, if you direct a bomb, for instance, and will you get another chance, and all of that. But one thing that came out of this, and here this goes again to another stone turned, is when I got my MFA, I was literally broke, no money. And I didn't even have enough money to move to the West Coast, which is what I wanted to do. And I read an article in the travel and leisure section of the New York Times about this former Hollywood producer by the name of Spiro Skouras Sr. was the Hollywood producer. His son was running a ship company called Prudential Lines, which sailed a series of ships, part cargo and part passenger, all around Latin America, South America, and up the west coast of the United States. I just wrote him a letter out of the blue and said, I just graduated from Yale, and this sounds like a fascinating opportunity, and I work really cheaply to do some filming for you and get people to sign up for your cruises. And he responded. And I managed to draft a good friend and another filmmaker based in New Haven at Yale. And we went in and we chatted him up. And next thing we knew, we were traveling all around South America for the better part of 6 months.
Making a film about this voyage, or like a promo film for the company, right?
It's actually a promo film for the company, and then also like 12 informational films as here's what you do when you stop in Rio, or if you want to take a break and fly out to Easter Island. I mean, we went everywhere. That's Galapagos cool. Islands, Easter Island. And so you can go back to the Yale experience and say, well, if I hadn't gone back to Yale, would I have been able to drop Yale's name to Spiro Skouras, and would he have gotten all excited and sent me to Latin America, to South America? No. So it's funny how things, work out.
Right. Am I understanding correctly that he didn't have an ad saying we need a filmmaker? You read about this and said, what you could use is a film, and then did it.
Purely self-initiated.
I've seen you play that card before, or later, I guess, in life, right?
Where you say, you need is a movie. Yeah, that's it. Sort of, and it's just sort of kept the story going, or unfolding, or changing direction, or various things. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're really jumping ahead, but your most recent finished film, Deej, began very much like that as well, right? You heard a story about someone on the radio and said that could be a movie, and that was it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of good documentaries come out of that, as the right person hears about a story that's playing out in some fashion or other, and invest the opportunity to check it out. And the next thing you know, you're totally absorbed in it. And that's what you do for the next few years.
Yeah, I was going to say, and then 10 years have passed somehow.
Yeah.
So you go around South America. That's your first movie. And then I take it you had enough money to drive west, spend the night near Joni Mitchell, then make it to California. Is that fair?
Yeah. And it was great. I had a Steenbeck editing table set up in an LA apartment, and I was editing all these films when I landed in LA. But what I should just highlight is that in these 5 or 6 months in South America, I got an incredible education about disparity and inequality. Whether it's filming in Rio and you've got the Copacabana beaches, but right 3 blocks away are the favelas all the way up and down the mountainside. Or I remember being in Cusco, which is kind of the way in which you get to Machu Picchu. Cusco is a destination in and of itself. It's this incredible, 5-century-old town with a lot of Inca influences, as well as the Spanish who came and ended up building their buildings on top of the Inca foundations. And I still remember seeing this impoverished child crying in the front, not even a yard, postage stamp, with nobody else in sight, but with the one of the big disco hits of the time, "Fly, Robin, Fly," playing in the background. It's just this mind warp, We ended up in Buenos Aires just after the military coup there. And in fact, we were accosted, surrounded at gunpoint at one point.
Wow.
By people who were worried that we had more nefarious intentions than to film this pretty Victorian architecture.
How did you get out of that?
Sorry?
How did you get out of being held at gunpoint? Okay.
And
hold your hands
enough
up.
time, yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So
I didn't know that.
It was just so I resolved that I still had this idea that filmmaking was auteurish. And so the kind of subjects that I was going to pursue as an auteur were going to be stories of inequality and disparity, to the point of where my writing partner, Frank Huttinger, who you know, and I wrote a script, and it made the rounds, and it was about fighting against deforestation in the Amazon, plus a love interest and the other things that we thought would help it sell. It didn't. And the process of trying to market or try to sell that film told me it was not a pleasant experience, and I just didn't feel at that time. I just didn't feel like I had the writing chops to do it, and I certainly didn't have the salesperson chops. So
did you go? How did you become? If the script didn't get you in, how did you get into the directing movie Hollywood world? What was your way in?
Well, here's another stone turned.
All right.
The Directors Guild of America has this program called the Assistant Directors Training Program. And they literally, I lined up with maybe 1,000 people outside a building at the USC, University of Southern California, and took your basic aptitude test, whatever. It's just a way of narrowing the numbers down to maybe 100, which they then interview. And I actually didn't get accepted in the first round, but it happened to be that this was a year in which there was a lot of production, and they needed more trainees. So they invited me aboard, and I spent the next 400 work days working for peanuts, really. But every couple of months, I'd be assigned to a different Hollywood production. So I worked for, get this, the original, on the original Charlie's Angels. And the Hardy Boys, and a couple of movies too. Tom Horn with Steve McQueen, and Brubaker, Robert Redford, and so on. And it was my entree into a viable way to be part of the filmmaking community, but as an assistant director. And the difference between a director and assistant director is actually 180 degrees, because the director is the person who dreams and collaborates with, works with actors and with the cinematographer and makes beautiful pictures and movement with the camera and so forth. The assistant director, first I was a trainee, but then I became a second assistant director, and ultimately I became a first assistant director. And the first assistant director is the person who make sure that everything is where it needs to be at the given time, so the director can create the scene.
That sounds really hard. It sounds so hard. I would be horrible at it.
Well, you're never alone, because there is a crew of assistant directors. There are usually, by the time you count in trainees and production assistants, there might be 5 or 6 of you. But the first AD is the person who's. I had a rule when as the first assistant director. I had the 10-foot tether rule. I was never more than, other than occasionally to the bathroom, I was never more than 10 feet away from the camera. And I had my walkie-talkie, and second assistant directors and trainees and production assistants are all running rings around you, getting people through makeup and hair, and making sure all the extras are checked in, and making sure the effects knows that we're only 2 shots away from when they're going to need to blow something up or whatever. So that became my conduit in order to pay the bills, but also be doing something productive and creative and challenging. But it was really the opposite side, flip side of the coin from being a director. And I missed that. So eventually, when I was actually within the Directors Guild, I was making enough money so that I could take breaks in between shows, which is a good thing because movie production, it's absurd in this country how it's, you film for 12 hours. If you're an assistant director, you work for 15 or 16. And there's a joke actually in the directors, DGA people, that the reason the Directors Guild's pension plan is so good is so few people survive to claim it. Not quite true, but
yeah.
But I started again. I was letter writing. I wrote letters to UNICEF and to World Neighbors and a lot of other international organizations that were involved in poverty issues and so on. And so a couple of them said yes, and I ended up volunteering my time, traveling with them to whatever program they wanted to have profiled. And essentially, I would make a little movie for them.
So similar to the South America trip in the sense that you said, hey, you might need a movie about what you're doing. Yeah. I'm someone who could do it and I'm going to volunteer. Is that, and then you would go on these cool trips. Okay.
And I would not charge my time. I would say, if you can underwrite the expenses of doing this, I'll volunteer my time. That continued in various forms for 2 or 3 decades. And it's always the way I work things is that half of the time I would be as an assistant director and I get paid well for what I'm doing. And the other half of the time I'd be working for nothing, but I'd be going off to some part of the world and making little movies.
Well, this is just it, right? I mean, not just it, but what I'm thinking about when I think of you as a filmmaker is it's so easy to say, yeah, you're a filmmaker. Here's the path to be a filmmaker. But already this is 2 very, very different worlds that you're moving between every 6 months or I don't know, 50-50, but chunks of it at a time where you're enmeshed in this Hollywood side of things. And then you're in Bangladesh on a raft with a camera, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
How disorienting was that? Or was it satisfying
It was satisfying in that, I've always been the kind of person who likes to do, have a job well done. So there's that assistant director part of it.
Yeah. I'm thinking back to when you, when you would help me and Garrett, when you help Garrett, my brother and me with our homework and you'd say, if you're not going to do it right, don't bother doing it at all. I'm like, oh God. And it was about whether Garrett fully erased something on a math problem. Anyway, the assistant director, perfectionism at its finest, but.
Yeah. And, but it was a good balance in the sense that both of them were taxing and demanding in different ways. Ultimately, I found the actual filmmaking most fulfilling, and it was my film school. I got really good at being a camera person, at being an editor. So, and that's really how I work to this day, even on my present project. Financially, it's critical that I cover this things firsthand, and that I'm the cheapest videographer I know. And over the years, I've gotten pretty decent at it, I think. And the same thing's true of editing. It was my film school, really. And the first time I deviated from that problem back in the 90s when you were still in high school or even earlier than that, when I met Muhammad Yunus, who is the founder of Grameen Bank, who people may or may not know was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in, I think it's 2006. And that sparked actually a decade of chronicling microcredit, as it was called, loaning money in small amounts to mostly women, poor people, but usually women with not many resources, any means, so they could, buy a cow, graze it in a ditch or something, have the milk, have the cow bred, have a calf they could sell, and so on, and ratcheting up their own economic advancement that way. And it has become a very significant tool in international development. It was really during the 90s that this happened. And I created this 2-part series called To Our Credit, which aired on PBS. And so it was really exciting to be a part of that. And that took me away from the assistant director work for a few years. But then the other thing it did is it caused the Directors Guild health insurance to lapse. And both you and your brother were not that far away from college. And so I actually, for a little while, I moved. We were in Maryland by this time, as you know. But I actually moved back and stayed with some good friends for months at a time in LA and pounded the pavements until my name got out there again. And I could once again, get enough work as the first assistant director. So that is back to that 50-50 balance then, until about, 2010 or something like that. So we're talking, and Deej, the project, the film that you mentioned, which was made in partnership with a non-speaking autistic young man through high school and the first part of college, was the first time I could really focus just on documentary filmmaking writ large, not just little educational or promotional or informative pieces for different nonprofits, but it was a film I wanted to do because I thought people should see it, and I felt that it would be really artistically satisfying to make it, and it was. So, but at that point, 2010, that means I had already broached 60. So, in answer to the question, which I, as you were growing up, I would often joke, and I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do when I grow up. That's kind of it. I think it was kind of like just the last 15 years or so that I've said, this is really what I was made to do. This is really the full expression of what I can do. Which is not to say that it's not challenging and difficult in some ways. And we can talk about the economics of something like that if you like. But it was just like being able to totally pour oneself creatively into a project, and it was yours, and it wasn't for somebody else. It just deserved to be made. First time I had the luxury of doing that was when I was already in my 60s.
And that's our show. Thank you so much for listening to Majoring in Everything. I'm your host, Andrea Jones-Rooy, and Majoring in Everything is a proud member of the World's Smartest Podcast Network. Be sure to check out worldsmartestpodcastnetwork.com and our partner shows. We are edited by Eric P. Stipe, who says that I need an outro, so I'm making one. Eric, does this count? Are you happy? I hope so. Thanks again for listening. Keep majoring in everything. Bye.